On the evening of April 17th, 1906, the kerosene lamp above the kitchen sink burned, as it usually did, suspended from a single nail driven into the wall long before anyone could remember. Its flame gave off the familiar, restrained hiss of a properly trimmed wick drawing evenly from its reservoir. The sound no longer registered as something separate. It belonged to the house in the same way as the creak of floorboards or the low, steady breathing of the iron stove, part of a settled order noticed only when it failed. The lamp's glass chimney, dulled by years of soot and uneven cleaning with rags and ashes, softened the flame into a muted yellow glow that would not quite hold still. The light wavered just enough to send slow shadows drifting across the plank walls whenever a chair shifted or someone crossed the narrow space between table and stove. It did not so much illuminate the kitchen as inhabit it, filling the room unevenly and leaving the corners indistinct. The space took its character from that light, a pattern established over decades and no longer questioned. The air carried the residue of the day's labor. Beneath the heavier odor of potatoes boiled too long lingered the sharper tang of whey from the morning's milking, a smell that clung to clothing and wood alike. Damp wool coats hung near the stove, giving off warmth and moisture whenever the firebox door was opened to add another split of maple. The floorboards, worn smooth by generations of boots and bare feet, were darkened by stains where water had spilled and dried so often that the marks had become permanent, visible only to those who made the effort to see them. The farmhouse stood on a gradual rise several miles outside town, overlooking the broad curve of the Kickapoo River Valley. Pasture land fell away toward the low ground near the river, its lines broken by fences, scattered hardwoods, and the low, practical bulk of the barn. From the kitchen window, the land divided itself into familiar segments of field and post and rail. That evening the last daylight lingered thin and pale, brushing the tops of fence posts and briefly catching on bare maple branches before slipping behind the hills. Inside the barn, the cows shifted in their stanchions with unhurried patience, indifferent to the light withdrawing beyond the walls. Jacob Rasmussen stood at the table with his weight unevenly set, as though the floor itself required constant adjustment. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, the cloth still faintly cool and damp from pumping water earlier in the evening. In his hands he held a single sheet of paper folded into quarters, its edges softened by weeks of handling. He smoothed it flat with his palm and folded it again along the same creases, the motion less deliberate than habitual, a way of keeping his hands occupied while his thoughts moved in slow, circular paths. The estimate had arrived in January, carried out from town by a representative who spoke easily of wires, currents, and modern convenience. The paper had been wrapped in oilcloth against snow and damp. At the top of the page were terms Jacob rarely encountered in his daily life, followed by columns of figures arranged with a confidence that felt foreign. Treated poles, porcelain insulators, copper wire measured by the foot, labor hours calculated as though weather, illness, and chance were inconveniences rather than governing conditions. He traced one column with his thumb, then another, as if sustained attention might somehow alter the numbers themselves. Anna stood at the stove, stirring the potatoes with slow, practiced movements that required little thought. Though she did not look toward the table, she was aware of the paper's presence, the way one becomes aware of an object in a room without turning toward it. From time to time her fingers paused on the spoon, opening and closing slightly as she tested the stiffness left by winter. Fine cracks marked her knuckles where the skin rarely healed fully before splitting again. She wiped her hands on her apron, adjusted the pot, and continued. Near the door, the children's boots were lined up in a careful row, toes angled inward from habit rather than instruction. Dried manure clung to the soles, and the leather was darkened and misshapen by long use, shaped to growing feet. Their presence marked the hour as clearly as the fading light outside, a quiet indication that the working day was giving way to evening. The stillness shifted when Ingrid crossed the room toward the stairs. Loose strands of hair slipped free from her braid and caught the lamplight as she passed. Her bare feet made little sound on the worn boards. She stopped beside the railing and fixed her gaze on the small wooden plate fastened to the wall, pale against the darker planks. At its center sat a porcelain switch, smooth and white, newly installed. It was not connected to anything yet, but it waited all the same, drawing attention without effort. She asked carefully whether it would hurt if it were working. Anna answered without turning, telling her not to touch it. The words shaped more by caution than fear. Even so, Ingrid's finger drifted closer, hovering just short of the surface, curiosity briefly outweighing restraint. Nils leaned forward on the bench, watching with contained excitement, while Marta continued repairing the tear in Jacob's work shirt. The needle passed in and out of the fabric with steady regularity, the thread tightening and loosening in a quiet rhythm. Nils murmured that it would probably shock you, like the new pasture fence, his tone carrying admiration more than warning. Jacob looked up then, taking in the switch on the wall, the folded paper on the table, and the children's faces briefly linked by something not yet visible. He said only that no one was to touch it, and that it was not theirs. The word settled heavily in the room. After it came the low sound of a cow shifting in the barn and the dull strike of a hoof against wood. Jacob thought of evenings measured by the height of a flame, of winter days compressed by darkness, of work finished by feel when light failed too early, and of a body trained in endurance not by choice but by repetition. They ate in near silence, the muted clink of utensils and the steady crack of burning would filling the spaces between them. When the meal was finished, Jacob pulled on his coat and went out to the barn with Nils. Night had closed in fully, the sky clear and cold, the stars sharp above the valley. The lantern cast a small, moving circle of light, revealing and concealing the cows' flanks as they passed. The work followed its familiar order, the stools scraping against the floor, hands finding their places, milk striking the pail in steady metallic bursts. Nils breathed hard as he tried to keep pace and said that people claimed electric light meant you didn't have to hurry so much against the dark. Jacob did not answer. His body continued what it had learned over years, while his thoughts lingered on something not yet real. When they returned to the house, Anna had lit the second lamp, a small concession they usually avoided. The kitchen appeared larger under the added light, but also more exposed, the children seated at the table tracing shapes in spilled flour. Later, as the coffee cooled and the house settled into its nighttime sounds, Anna said quietly that they could not afford it. Jacob nodded. The estimate lay folded between them, unchanged. The days that followed did not distinguish themselves from those that had come before. Nothing in the outward order of the farm suggested that change had already begun to press inward. April eased into May as it always had in the valley, mornings heavy with the smell of damp soil and cold iron, afternoons offering only restrained warmth. Frost lingered in shaded places, and the low ground near the river stayed soft underfoot. Chores proceeded in their accustomed sequence. Cows milked and fed, fences walked, buckets lifted and emptied, meals prepared and cleared at hours fixed by long habit, and yet beneath that repetition something subtle shifted. The work itself did not change, but the way it was carried began, quietly, to alter. The switch on the wall became part of that alteration. It was never spoken of, and yet it exerted influence all the same. Jacob noticed his eyes returning to it while pulling on his boots in the morning or rinsing his hands at the sink, his attention drawn without intent, as though the small square of white porcelain had begun to organize the space around it. Anna paused more often near the stairs, standing an extra moment before moving on. Even the children passed that section of the kitchen with greater care, as if something there required acknowledgement despite remaining unused. Jacob felt his fatigue change character as the days went on. It did not sharpen into pain, nor did it lift with rest. Instead, it thickened and persisted, settling into his shoulders and lower back in a way that sleep no longer fully relieved. He woke with the sense that the day had already moved ahead of him, and by late afternoon his movements quickened without conscious decision, his hands anticipating the approach of darkness, even while the sun still stood well above the tree line. The lamp was lit earlier most evenings now, not because the room yet required it, but because it soon would. The act felt less like choice than admission. Early in May, Ingrid returned from school with dust on the hem of her dress and a folded paper tucked into her pocket. As Anna worked at the table, Ingrid mentioned, using the same even tone she used for spelling lists or arithmetic, that her teacher had spoken of a farm near Lafarge where electric light had recently been installed in the house. There was no excitement in her voice, no judgment, only the passing along of a fact. Even so, Jacob felt the distance between that place and their own compress inward. The miles that separated them no longer felt protective. They seemed modest, easily crossed. That evening, while tightening a loose hinge on the barn door and listening to the hollow sound of metal striking wood, Jacob found himself counting those miles without intending to. He recalled stretches of road that held water after rain and others that dried quickly, the farms that lay between, the land changing so gradually that one rarely noticed it happening. Electric light no longer felt confined to town or to people whose lives differed sharply from his own. It had moved closer, near enough to be measured against the rhythms of his day. At the cooperative, the milk price dropped several cents. The chalked figures were erased and replaced without comment, and no one lingered before the board long enough to register surprise. Men glanced once, nodded, and went on with their business. The adjustment followed Jacob home nonetheless. That night, he opened the ledger and flattened the page with his palm. The pencil moved carefully, erasing and rewriting, shifting amounts from one column to another. Each alteration carried a consequence. A purchase delayed, a tool made to serve another season, a coat repaired rather than replaced. Anna watched from the doorway, her shoulder resting against the frame. She did not interrupt. When she spoke, it was only to name what had already been observed, that her hands were slower to warm in the mornings now, that the ache lingered longer even after the work was done. She spoke of it as she spoke of weather or soil, without complaint and without request. The absence of demand pressed on Jacob more heavily than argument might have. The electric company's earlier visit left visible marks. Thin stakes appeared along the edge of the pasture, pale against the dark soil, indicating the intended line of poles. At first they seemed temporary, like survey markers meant to be pulled up and removed. As days passed and grass grew around their bases, they began to look settled. Jacob steered the cows around them with care, unconsciously measuring the distance from one to the next, imagining lines stretched overhead, humming faintly in the wind. One morning beneath a low, heavy sky, an older cow slipped while stepping out of the barn. She did not fall, but the sudden shift of weight caught Jacob off balance. He braced instinctively, his shoulder taking the strain. Pain flared sharply enough to steal his breath. He steadied the animal and finished the task without comment. Rinsing his hands afterward, and moving on as though nothing had changed. The pain did not leave him as the day wore on. It dulled and spread, settling deep into the joint, and by evening each movement carried a hesitation slight enough to escape notice. He felt it in the slowing of his pace, in the faltering of rhythms long practiced. He understood then, not with alarm, but with recognition, that the work depended upon the body in ways no estimate or ledger could ever fully account for. That night the lamp was lit for the third time. Its light seemed harsher than usual, casting shadows without softness. Anna noticed and said nothing, closing the window against a cold wind that carried the promise of rain. After the children went to bed, Jacob sat alone at the table as the house creaked and settled. His eyes returned again and again to the switch on the wall. He did not touch it. He watched how the lamplight caught its smooth surface, how clean it remained amid the surrounding dust. What he weighed was not comfort, but time, how much of it slipped away each evening, and how little control they held over its ending. The cost remained fixed in his mind, whole and unavoidable, like a fence that could only be crossed by choosing where to place one's foot. The following Sunday, returning from church, he stopped the wagon at the crest of a hill and looked out across the valley. Farms lay scattered below, some marked with stakes like his own, others unchanged. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and manure. He remained there longer than necessary, not counting acres or cows, but measuring the distance between what had long been sufficient and what was beginning, quietly, to no longer be. When he turned the wagon toward home, the decision remained unspoken. But it was no longer distant. It had moved close enough to shape the days ahead. The decision did not arrive as a single, decisive moment, nor did it separate itself cleanly from the days that carried it forward. It formed gradually, almost without notice, woven so tightly into routine that it became difficult to say where habit ended and intention began. By the time Jacob understood that he was no longer weighing alternatives, but moving toward an outcome, the motion itself was already underway. The morning he drove into Viroqua broke low and gray. Fog lay thick across the Kickapoo Valley, softening every line it touched, drawing fences, trees, and fields closer together until the landscape seemed less observed than remembered. Sound traveled differently in the damp air. Hooves struck the ground with muted finality. Wagon wheels turned without echo, and even the birds were quieter than usual. It was mid-May of 1906, though the cold still lingered in the hollows. In the barn, the cows shifted restlessly while Jacob moved through the familiar sequence of tasks, adjusting his stance to accommodate the ache lodged deep in his shoulder, an ache that no longer surprised him but now demanded constant attention. He finished the milking without interruption, rinsed the pails, and set them aside with deliberate care. At the pump he lingered longer than usual, washing his hands until the skin felt tight and raw, as though the act itself were a form of preparation. He dried them carefully on the coarse towel, selected his better coat from the peg by the door, and brushed the dust from its shoulders, taking more time than necessity required. He placed his hat on his head and adjusted the brim until it sat as it should. Anna observed these details without comment, her posture unchanged at the stove. When Jacob said he needed to be in town before noon, she received the statement with a single nod and asked no question. The road into town bore the marks of recent rain. Deep ruts guided the wagon's course, shallow pools reflecting the dull sky. As he traveled, Jacob passed farms he had known all his life, barns weathered into familiar shapes, gates hanging at the same angles year after year, fields carrying the quiet assurance of continuity. In some places, pale stakes marked the intended line of poles. In others, there was nothing at all to suggest change. He found himself wondering what separated one field from the next, whether it was money, timing, or simply the moment when waiting became heavier than moving. The town felt contained when he reached it, as though it absorbed excess motion. Men stood quietly outside the hardware store, hands in their pockets. Grain dust hung in the air near the mill, settling on every surface with fine persistence. Jacob tied the horse and stood for a moment before moving on, adjusting his coat and steadying his breath. When he entered the electric company office, modest, orderly, with clean windows and a recently painted door, the air carried the faint smells of paper, oil, and metal. The man behind the desk recognized him immediately and showed no surprise. He drew out a chair and laid the familiar estimate on the desk as though it had been waiting there. He spoke of schedules and available crews, of work that could begin within weeks and be completed with minimal interruption. His voice was steady and practiced, shaped by repetition and by an assumption that time itself would cooperate. Jacob listened and nodded when expected, taking in less the details than the certainty with which they were delivered. When the pen was placed in his hand, it felt heavier than it should have. The hesitation that followed did not come from doubt. Doubt had already been worn thin, but from recognition. He understood that certain lines, once drawn, could not be erased without leaving a trace. His hand trembled slightly as he signed his name. When he passed the paper back across the desk, the room seemed to settle differently around him, as though something unseen had shifted into place. By the time he left town, the fog had begun to lift. Narrow bands of sunlight broke through the cloud cover, illuminating portions of the fields while leaving others in shadow. He stopped the wagon once along the road, resting his hands on the reins and breathing deeply. He felt neither relief nor satisfaction, only a new, steady weight that would now accompany him. Anna did not ask where he had been when he returned. When she saw the folded paper tucked carefully inside his coat, she understood without explanation. That evening she spoke only of practical matters, stretching the kerosene supply, postponing a repair on the north side of the barn, planning meals that would carry farther. Her voice remained even. Later, when she lay down to sleep, her hands stayed open on the quilt for a long moment, as though they required time to release the day. In the weeks that followed, the farm began to alter its outline. Men arrived early, wearing unfamiliar boots, their voices carrying across the fields as holes were dug and earth piled, tamped, and set. Holes were raised one by one, interrupting the horizon that had once appeared continuous. Jacob noticed these changes more than he expected to. The lines of the land shifted subtly. The children watched from a distance, quiet and attentive. Ingrid touched the switch with casual familiarity, as though it had always belonged there. The work did not lessen with the arrival of hired hands. Instead, it intensified, layers of labor accumulating atop what already existed. One afternoon, when a post shifted unexpectedly at its base, Jacob stepped forward without thought. The transfer of weight came too quickly. His shoulder failed with sudden, complete pain that drove the breath from his chest. He released his grip in time for the others to secure the load and then sat heavily in the grass, holding his arm close and breathing carefully until the pain dulled. Around him, the work resumed. Voices lowered, movements adjusted. The post was set without him. That night the milking was done in his absence. Anna and Nils worked in silence while Jacob sat on a low bench and watched. The barn sounded as it always had. The cows responded no differently. For the first time, he understood not only that the farm could continue without him at its center, but that in practice it already did. Days later, the wires were strung, thin lines cutting across the sky, barely visible except when the light caught them at an angle. Inside the house, the smell of kerosene lingered, mingling with an anticipation no one named. On the evening the company representative completed the final connection, no one spoke. The bulb above the table lit instantly, white and unwavering, revealing cracks in the boards, stains long ignored, and the fatigue etched into familiar faces. The old lantern still hung above the sink. It was not extinguished that night. It burned quietly and unattended as the new light filled the room. Outside, nothing had changed. Inside, the day no longer ended with darkness, and time itself stretched beyond its former limits, without any clear means of drawing it back. The light did not remake the farm in any sudden or decisive way. There was no morning when Jacob woke with the sense that everything had crossed cleanly into a new condition. What changed did so gradually, through small adjustments that rarely announced themselves, settling into the days the way weather settles into a season, recognized only after it had already altered the shape of ordinary life. At first, Anna continued to reach for the lantern out of habit. Her hand moved toward the nail above the sink, even while the electric bulb burned steadily overhead. When she became aware of the motion, she paused briefly before turning down the wick, a thin curl of smoke rising as though the act marked acknowledgement rather than refusal. Under the electric light, the kitchen appeared sharper, its surfaces less forgiving. Details once softened by shadow emerged with clarity. The grain of the boards, old stains and patched repairs, the lines in their faces more distinctly drawn. The room was not unfamiliar, but it felt exposed, as though there were now fewer places for where to hide. Ingrid stayed at the table longer in the evenings, her books spread wide, her pencil moving steadily across the page. No longer pressed by thinning light, she worked without hurry or comment, her concentration suggesting that the day no longer closed in behind her as quickly as it once had. Marta remained up later to mend and sort, her stitches smaller and more exact. Nils lingered near the door that led to the barn, measuring himself against the work he knew would soon demand more of him, the extended hours making the future feel nearer and less abstract. Jacob's shoulder improved slowly and never completely. The sharpness faded into a dull presence that returned whenever he reached too far or lifted without care. In learning to accommodate it, he also learned to allow the farm to redistribute its demands. Tasks passed more readily to Nils. Decisions were spoken aloud with Anna that had once remained unspoken. The work itself did not diminish, but it no longer rested entirely on a single body. The adjustment unsettled him even as it provided a measure of steadiness. The payments required constant attention. Money was counted and recounted, repairs postponed, purchases reconsidered, not as sacrifices announced aloud, but as quiet modifications absorbed into the weekly routine. The cost was no longer abstract or confined to figures on a page. It appeared instead in the small decisions that shaped each day, present but rarely named. By summer, insects gathered thickly around the bulb at night, their wings tapping softly against the glass. Anna found herself wiping it clean more often than she had ever cleaned the lantern chimney. At times she turned the light off earlier than necessary and opened the window, letting the warm darkness return. The night air carried familiar sounds, cattle shifting in their stalls, wind moving through the trees, reminding her that darkness had never been an adversary, only a boundary that once marked the end of work. Jacob noticed that evening no longer arrived as a natural stopping point. Without the quiet authority of night to draw a line through the hours, there was always another task that could be finished, another detail that fit easily into the extended time. The urgency that had once governed his movements softened, replaced by a quieter persistence, an expectation that time, once made available, ought to be used. He found himself learning when to stop in ways he had never needed before. Autumn returned to the valley in its accustomed order. Fields shifted color, the air cooled, and the days shortened again, though the house remained lit with steady regularity. By then the switch on the wall no longer drew attention. It had become part of the structure itself, as ordinary as a beam or a hinge. The children used it without thought, as though it had always belonged there, the novelty fully absorbed into routine. One evening, while searching for a length of rope in the shed, Jacob came upon the old lantern. Dust had settled inside the glass, and the wick lay stiff and unused. He took it down and held it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight and noticing, with some surprise, how light it seemed. He returned it to its hook without lighting it and without discarding it, allowing it to remain, neither active nor removed. Winter arrived in its own time, slow and inevitable. Snow gathered along the fences and pressed against the barn walls. Inside the house, the light held steady through the long nights, altering how those nights were endured. Anna's hand still ached, though with less sharpness. Jacob's shoulder never forgot its weakness, but it no longer defined the limits of his work. The farm continued as it always had, demanding attention, effort, and patience. Nothing had been fully resolved. The land still required labor. Money still demanded careful accounting. Bodies continued to register their limits. Even so, the house had learned a different rhythm of breathing. The work no longer pressed the day so tightly against the night, and the space between one task and the next stretched just enough to allow for continuity. Life advancing without haste, one motion following another, beneath a light that promised no ease, but offered endurance. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.